Hi, and welcome to this episode of Carrier Wrap. Today we're going to be discussing net neutrality and the business of virtualization. All of that after this. Welcome back. This is Kelly Hill, editor for Test and Measurement with RCR Wireless News. For our first episode of 2018, we're going to talk with Dan Hayes of PwC about net neutrality and the implications for mobile specifically. I also had a conversation with Ari Banerjee of Nutcracker about the business of virtualization. So first up is Dan and net neutrality. The Federal Communications Commission decision to lift Title II restrictions on internet service providers was largely welcomed by the telecom industry, although consumer advocates and internet companies were, shall we say, less than enthused. The decision was made back in mid-December, but the issue is far from dead. Congress has 60 legislative days to reverse the FCC's decision, and frankly, I have no idea how the current government shutdown might impact that timeline. And Democrats apparently are one vote short of the 51 votes that are needed for their resolution to restore net neutrality to pass. There have also been a flurry of lawsuits that were filed last week, including one that was filed by 21 state attorneys general that claims the decision to lift net neutrality broke federal law and was, quote, arbitrary and capricious, unquote. So let's hear from Dan Hayes about his thoughts on net neutrality as it relates to mobile. So this is Kelly Hill, editor for Test and Measurement of RCR Wireless News. I'm here with Dan Hayes of PwC. Welcome back, Dan.
Oh, thanks so much, Kelly. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you back. So we are going to be talking about net neutrality today, and I want to talk about some of the implications for mobile, or maybe the not so much implications. So obviously we had this decision by the FCC to lift Title II regulations on internet service providers. What does this mean for mobile? How much were they really sort of falling under that umbrella in the past? Gosh, was it 2 years? Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it's been what, 2.5 years or so, something like that we've had these current net neutrality provisions. And I think that, while the impact on the mobile operators may be a little muted to begin with, there's going to be a lot of knock-on effects to them. Mobile has largely been excluded from a lot of net neutrality. So, all the concerns about would zero rating be prohibited? Would all of these, thresholds for usage and throttling, would they have issues? I think the carriers over the last few years have been pretty successful in convincing the regulators that mobile was a special case, that you have variable coverage, variable signal strength and speeds. So they kind of got away from that. But now with the rollback of the net neutrality provisions, we're expecting there to actually be a number of effects on the mobile operators, not the least of which is all of the OTT services and what might happen to them, and what the changes in cost structure for the OTT services might then mean for the mobile operators themselves. Will they be able to zero rate some of these services? Will they be able to, continue to bundle things with some of the OTT providers? That may be in question as the costs for the OTT providers potentially rise. But time will really tell.
And then, so let's talk a little bit about, there's been some reactions. I think you have Chuck Schumer on the Democratic side saying we're going to force a vote, to put some of this back in place. You have some of the states filing lawsuits. Do you think some of these sort of anti net neutrality reactions, do you see them going anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is yet to play out. We will not. What we've heard so far this last week or two is not the last that we're going to hear of net neutrality. The states certainly are going to challenge the FCC's rights on this, and regardless of what the FCC put in its order, think there's going to be a debate about whether the states have some some authority in this domain. That may or may not be relevant going forward. The bigger challenge is likely, however, to be whether this gets challenged in court. The District Court of Appeals previously heard the last challenges on net neutrality and upheld the rules that the FCC had put in place. It's unclear whether they'll be as supportive of this latest framework that's been put forward. But that certainly is going to take at least months to play out, if not longer. That most of the players in the whole sort of value chain that's impacted by net neutrality are probably going to proceed with caution in the coming months. Certainly, it's going to take someone to make a bold move before they really unwind the current set of behaviors. And I think even the FCC has said that they're expecting a degree of transparency with consumers. So how that really works and how this is all going to play out has yet to be seen. But much as we did before the 2015 rules were established, we're likely to see some of the vanguards in this space really test the waters, see what they can get away with, perhaps, and whether it's the carriers or whether it's over-the-top players or some combinations thereof. So we'll see, but this is going to be a story, I think, for many months to come.
So we should get out our microscopes to actually read those terms of service is probably a good idea.
You don't do that? We all read them so closely.
Scroll. So, you mentioned the impact on mobile carriers specifically, but I think it's also important to point out that, there aren't really a whole lot of standalone wireless carriers in the market these days. Most of them are increasingly media companies. You have AT&T is still slogging its way through, trying to make that Time Warner merger work. You have Verizon and Oath. It's not just about mobile. There's definitely a content aspect to more and more. And then you have, as you pointed out, partnerships like what T-Mobile has done with Netflix. I think Sprint, I want to say maybe Hulu. Did they do something recently?
There's been a bunch of announcements. I think all of the carriers at this point have either acquired internet companies, acquired media companies, launched over-the-top services of their own, invested in over-the-top services. And, increasingly with this latest ruling, those look like they might be wise moves because they give them a little more of bargaining leverage when it comes to dealing with other content providers, whether it's for video services or over-the-top services. It's very hard, and the lines are getting more and more blurry. At the same time, we're seeing more vertical mergers. We're seeing, more mergers and roll-ups in the media space. Some big announcements this week, and additional deals that are still working their way through the FCC and DOJ approval processes. So, how that's going to play out and what the bargaining positions of the different players are going to be is still an open question. I think one of the fears that many people have is that you start to see this segmentation or bifurcation of access to content, right? If I have a mobile device or a video service with provider X, then can I only see provider X's channels that they own? How do I get access to the other ones? That's a legitimate concern. Yet I think that there's enough watchdogs out there, and even if it's shifting from the FCC to the FTC now a little bit, it seems apparent that there's still a regulatory regime, albeit not so clear at the moment, but one that's there to oversee and protect consumers in particular. So we'll see, but quite frankly, we expect that there's going to be, if anything, an uptick in deals activity. And that the rollback of net neutrality could really shuffle the playing cards a bit and cause some of the different participants in the industry to really look at where they should be playing and whether M&A may be the way to get there. And of course, this is, we have to remember this is a very US centric view as well.
Yeah.
There's a big world out there and we're just a part of it. Other countries are going to be looking at this as an example and look at their own regimes for net neutrality. And, they may or may not choose to go the route that the US has gone. Only time will tell.
Mhm. So do you think this is going to have actual, noticeable impact in terms of network investment? I mean, so many of the arguments, for or against net neutrality to begin with were about, is this incentivizing network investment, or does this mean that, network operators will avoid network investment because they won't necessarily have, such sure footing in terms of, recouping that investment. I've also, seen, I think CTIA tweeted about how, this is going to be great for, for 5G because it means that, carriers will be able to, charge accordingly on a new, faster, higher broadband network.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, the great myth of network investment is something that comes up over and over and over again when it comes to net neutrality. The reality is network investment is a complicated number that's driven by a lot of factors, whether it's generations of technology or whether it is just the economic cycle or the level of competition in the industry. And we've seen over the last couple of years as 4G kind of wrapped up its rollout for the most part and 5G is waiting in the wings, network investment has been down quite a bit. Not really a surprise to anybody, but is it really due to net neutrality? I'm not so sure. Now, I think the reality going forward is the rollback of net neutrality does open up the doors for some more investment. It could be a positive for 5G. It could be a positive even for fiber build-outs that have largely stagnated over the last couple of years. That's going to be a difficult one to read. I don't think we should just attribute it blindly to net neutrality by any means. But at the same time, I guess as a consumer, I always step back and say, well, I'm paying for my monthly service. I'm supposed to get certain speeds, certain data volumes. It feels a little bit like at times, the carriers are trying to double dip, right? They want to charge the content companies for the same network investment and capability that I'm really supposed to be paying for. So which is it? Not so clear. And we'll see how it plays out, but I'm not so sure that we're going to see this massive uptick all of a sudden in network investment just because of this change in regulation.
So I want to piggyback on that and hit one other point that we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the role of Wi-Fi, because as we've seen, traffic patterns have really shifted. Mobile cellular is one thing, but when you start talking about, what is sort of the workhorse of quote unquote mobile networks, there's a lot of data that's being consumed over Wi-Fi, which ultimately goes back to, whomever your internet provider is. Any thoughts on sort of, the role of cellular versus Wi-Fi and, the implications there and how that sort of ties into this overall conversation?
Yeah, I mean, Wi-Fi continues to really be the workhorse of the wireless industry. Right? I mean, depending on what you believe, 85, 90% of network traffic is carried over Wi-Fi these days. And a lot of people don't even realize that those mobile devices, whether it's their smartphone or even their cellular connected iPad or laptop, most of the time they're using it on Wi-Fi. And that keeps their bills down. It keeps the cost of the network service down. But it does require that backhaul, that wireline connection. And that's where I think we're going to see the most activity right now is in the wireline space. The wireline providers, whether it's been cable, fiber, or other, have all bemoaned the challenges of network traffic, particularly video, since they're the ones that are having to absorb the greatest increases in video and streaming on networks. Right? Most people aren't streaming the video when they're driving their car down the road. They're streaming the video when they're sitting on their couch at home or maybe when they're at the office. Don't tell anybody. And so, right now, that's going to be probably ground zero for for net neutrality. It's going to be with those wired broadband connections and the costs that the carriers are incurring to keep up with the capacity demands that they have. So we're certainly going to see that, but Wi-Fi doesn't show any signs of going away. If anything, there's a lot of calls to, maybe release some new bands to support Wi-Fi of spectrum, and certainly there's a growing thesis out there around unlicensed spectrum, and how enterprise LTE networks may also be an offload for the cellular networks on top of Wi-Fi, something that can be more controlled in either an office building or a campus environment. So definitely going to be a lot of movement in that space here in the next couple of years as well.
Okay, great. Well, Dan, thanks for letting us pick your brain here today about net neutrality and all the other things we should be keeping an eye on. So it's going to be a conversation I'm sure we'll have to revisit. Who knows how often over the next few years.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, so some good food for thought as we continue to follow what happens with net neutrality and if Ajit Pai's lifting of Title II will stand. So now on to some talk about virtualization. For this, I spoke with Ari Banerjee, who is Vice President of Strategy from Netcracker. He's going to give us a pretty broad overview of what he's seeing in terms of trends, the business case for virtualization, and some real-world examples of operators and other businesses that are adopting virtualization and the value that they're seeing out of it. He even takes a look forward to the impact of 5G and IoT and the future of virtualization at scale. So here's that interview. This is Kelly Hill, editor for Test and Measurement with RCR Wireless News. I'm here with Ari Banerjee, who is VP of Strategy for Netcracker. How are you, Ari?
I'm doing great. Hi, Kelly. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, good. So we're going to be discussing the business of virtualization today. I'm wondering if you can maybe start us off with some perspective on, on what opportunities virtualization can open up for carriers or for enterprises, for that matter, and sort of how it enables new opportunities.
Sure. Very, very, very good question, Kelly. I mean, the biggest thing with virtualization was that it's going to, increase time to market for operators. I mean, that was a big thing for them. Help them innovate, help them compete with over-the-top players, and so on. And I think that promise is still there, and I think that's the main area where operators are looking at. So let's pick a couple of things. Value-added services for operators. They have always done it. They have done it forever. It just takes them 12 to 15 months to do that. Now, with virtualization, you can bring that time down to weeks, to days, in fact, if possible, if it's done the right way. I think that's a big thing. The second, can you bring your costs down when you're launching these new services? How can you innovate? How can you bring a whole bunch of different services together, which makes it more attractive to the enterprise customers? Many different things. Customer experience part of it becomes important as well, because as you provide more services, you become more sticky. Mm-hmm. Then you tend to become more close to your customers. So all of that plays in a very big way. The innovation of business model is also very interesting. So there are certain enterprises, if I may say so, and they are value-added reseller for the enterprise segment, moving their business model where they used to be more on-premise, typical on-premise business model, to more of a cloud-centric SaaS business model. So I think there are three dimensions. One is obviously around cost. The second is around time to market, which is very, very critical because we're talking about opportunity costs here. We're talking about competing with over-the-top players. All of those things which operators traditionally have struggled with. And the third part of it is innovation in the business model, which comes with the customer experience part of it. So I think there are different dimensions, and slowly but steadily, virtualization is moving into the right, in the right way. There has been some fits and starts. It's been a little slow in the beginning, but we see a lot more movement that we have seen in the early days, which is obvious. A lot of progress on the standard side. There's a lot of activity going on, a lot of open source. and operators putting their money where their mouth is, which is more RFPs, more RFIs. So they're spending and taking the risks associated with virtualization.
Okay. So you mentioned a few different aspects there. So do you see virtualization, or do you think operators and enterprises see virtualization now? Do they see it more as a way to cut costs? And I think part of that question is, does it really cut costs, or does it simply sort of shift them into, into something different than hardware, or as a strategy to enable new revenues? You mentioned that it's sort of both, but I'm curious, is it more one or the other right now, and do you kind of see that evolving over time?
So with the initial promise of virtualization, if we go back a few years, was around cutting cost. And we are going to cut our cost down by 40-50%, and we're going to do that, all of those good things. Quickly, that conversation changed, because people looked at it and said, well, cutting cost is such a defensive play. If we're going to just cut cost, why don't we start spending, do it a different way? How does it make us more innovative? How does it make us a digital service provider? How does it enable us to compete with the Googles or the Amazons of the world? So the enabler for cost cutting still remains. It doesn't go anywhere. But the bigger focus is time to market. Biggest focus is around innovation. And how can you do that with cost, with a little bit of a cost effectiveness? I mean, that becomes what is bigger than the other? Now, this is the interesting part, right? This use cases have to be validated by the CFO. It has to be signed off by the board. That's when all these things will make it really happen and move from the labs or the POCs and the trials and become a reality. In that context, the business case needs to have a combination of both. It's easier to justify on a business case that I am going to cut costs, or I'm going to make this cost savings over a period of 3 years by using these virtualized appliances, equipment, whatever we call it, or VNF functions, whatever. The other is that we are going to launch services, and it's going to be very sticky, because nobody knows which services are going to be captured, which services are going to be popular, and so on and so forth. So both the combinations still play a very important role. What's more, I think the cost cutting in the initial stages has a major justification factor, but that's not the only one. But as you look into 3 to 5 year time frame, it's about service innovation, it's about service generation, it's about time to market, it's about customer experience. That then becomes the real anchor.
Okay. So are operators doing this? I've been talking to AT&T. Obviously, they've been very, very public about, their intent to virtualize, I think 75% of their network. And I think they've recently said, they're on track to do even more than they had originally anticipated. That is including some of their 5G trial sites. And then, so do you see the industry making progress toward, and I have to say, it seems like the SD-WAN market, in terms of enterprise, there's a ton of interest there, and a ton of, offerings, and a ton of companies, making and enabling that. So, what do you see in terms of progress toward actually virtualizing networks?
I think you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, is the operators putting their money where their mouth is? I mean, that's really the question, right? And they are. AT&T, very good example. There are other major tier 1 operators across the globe. When you look at any pockets of the market, if you look at the European market, Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom, Colt, ET, everyone is evaluating, or they have launched RFPs and RFIs, and they have selected vendors and have started on their progress. Telefonica, as in a major way, have looked at it, looking at virtualization, one of our major customers, in fact, where we are helping them with the B2B business models and so on. If you look at the APAC market, again, many of our customers, such as Globe, such as Etisalat, Singtel, and many others, are looking at it. Obviously, if you look at the Japanese market, it's a bit ahead of the curve. They have looked at virtualization way before the market talked about virtualization. Again, NTT, the Docomo Properties, everyone, they have done it. They were the trailblazers. They started way earlier. Again, major customers of ours as part of any CNET cracker. So yes, um, much more investment, continuous investment with RFPs, with RFIs, with real projects are happening now. It has moved away from the lab discussion or the POCs of the trial discussion, whether this PNF works with that PNF or not. I think that conversation, we have evolved. We know it does. The technology is ready. The question today is the business ready? Are we looking at virtualization with the business focus? That becomes very critical. Because what we have seen is most of the operators who have been successful in launching virtualized services, I would pick up 3 or 4 of them who have done it really well, have taken a look at it from a much more of a business view. So it's not so much about technology. Of course, the technology needs to work, orchestration needs to work, all of that. But what is my business benefit, and how do we take a very business-oriented view? They've done it a little bit better than typically the operators who are looking at it more from what's the best architecture, what is the best technology, and what is. So there is that split. There is a view, so we have seen that happening, and we have seen that being very, very successful with people who have taken a much more of a business-oriented view, which is where it goes to where are operators spending money on virtualizations, typically around B2B services, typically around their enterprise segment. Not very surprising. I mean, there's obviously, they're doing it for consumer segment, don't get me wrong, but predominantly it's a B2B related, enterprise related service where they're spending money on virtualization. And the reason for that is very obvious, right? I mean, that is their most profitable segment. They are this medium to large to smaller businesses which spends tons of money with operators. And one of the things the operators are trying to do is move away from just being a connectivity player. I mean, they have always been treated as a connectivity. So my connections, I go to my operator, but for value-added services, I don't have to go. But with virtualization, that's what they're trying to do. Be on the equal playing field with the over-the-top layer. So they're not just a connectivity provider, but they're a value-added service provider, out of which connectivity is just one small component of it. And that's what virtualization brings for them, where you can bring in not just your connectivity services, but your firewall and security services, your SD-WAN related services. You have a multiple branch offices. You can bring together a bunch of other services which are, which was harder in the where you will be, relying on your over-the-top players. You are an operator. They are bringing it all together, and that I think becomes very important for them. They're becoming more sticky, and they're obviously becoming much more attractive to their enterprise customer. And virtualization, that's where we see a lot of our tier 1 customers spending a lot of money.
Do you have any sort of real world anecdote? You mentioned some examples. I don't know if you have any more specific anecdotes about, you mentioned business services. Obviously, you mentioned a number of operators that are investing in virtualization. I don't know if you can be any more specific about, some things that you've seen happen in the real world in terms of either improving operations or enabling new revenues.
So without naming names, I'm going to talk about 3 examples. One's a multi-country tier 1 operator they're all over. It's a group property, which is all over Europe and in other parts of the world and Latin America as well. They B2B, so this was from their B2B wing of the company, their business solutions wing. Now, they saw in the last few years that their revenues coming from the enterprise market was getting hit a little bit, and they wanted to do something about it. So they embraced virtualization. And what they did was they had a very aggressive time frame when they looked at virtualization. They worked with Netcracker, and we provided them the whole full stack, which is the whole customer management, orchestration, partner management, revenue management layer. We went live with them in 12 weeks. And from the 13th week, they started to launch their services and start making money with the customers, which is they could launch their whole security portfolio, start making money, have customers, adopt those services and so on. So 12 weeks, it was around 258 tasks, and it was whole agile DevOps kind of an environment where they had Scrum teams and satellite teams and all of that. Again, in the traditional world, to incubate, to test, and then to launch, and then to be able to build and provide it on a self-service portal and all of that within 12 weeks was unthinkable. So that's one with the time to market thing. The second one, I'll give an example, is not so much of it. This is not an operator, right? This is a major value-added IT reseller in the European market, certain parts of Europe. They're a major player. They compete with the Vodafones, they compete with the traditional big guys. Now, they had a very on-premise kind of a business model. What they wanted to do was to move away from an on-premise business model to much more of a cloud SaaS model. So instead of, so they used to sell package routers, package switches, and hardware and so on. What they wanted to do was, use that as a cloud-based application. So obviously router goes away, but the routing as a function for enterprises doesn't go away. Switching as a function doesn't really go away. How can you have that as a VNF function and then have that in a cloud marketplace kind of an environment? And how do you enable that to make a much more of a SaaS-based business model based on usage-based pricing and so on and so forth? And so that the initial peak, where it used to be very much an on-premise service and then maintenance over a period, now becomes year-to-year subscription-based VNF service. So very much a business model change for them using virtualization to do that. Uptake of the services went up by 15% within the first 6 weeks. The revenue generation went up by around 12%. And I'm just talking about the first 6 weeks of launch. The matrices have evolved much beyond that. Now that we are in the 5th month, we are in phase 3 or phase 4. So different ways of doing it. And the third is a major operator out in fact, in the Canadian market, one of our big customers, who looked at network as a service and have all these cloud-based applications in a digital marketplace. Think about that as an app store kind of a model for the enterprise customers. And what they have seen with that is the increase in the customer satisfaction of the enterprise customer going up there. So the NPS scores have increased, the CSAT scores have improved, and so on. A very classic example, I would say, of virtualization as an enabler for customer experience. So these are all real life examples of operators in different markets, looking at B2B. In some cases, looking at their traditionally, a lot of them are B2B centric, and obviously a value-added reseller, which is an enterprise value-added reseller company, who are competing with the telecom operators, utilizing this to compete with the operators. So it's a very interesting model. So they are riding with the operators on the network and then competing with them. Very, very, very successful. Again, using virtualization as a very strategic tool for them to differentiate themselves from the rest of the pack.
Okay, so then let me ask this. So did they need to change anything about either their business processes or their systems? What did they need to do as a business in order to take advantage of virtualization?
So I think we can good question. We can go back to the classics, right? The people, the process, the technology. And when we say people, it's really about organizational changes. So it's not the network silo versus the IT silo anymore, or the marketing silo within the operators or the enterprise. They're all working together. So there's all these guys have some things in common. One is they have this satellite teams, which is people from network with IT, with product management, with compliance, even with the tracker people in that whole satellite team, working more effectively across organizational boundaries. That is very important for them, because there are a lot of inputs. You cannot wait for the traditional waterfall kind of a thing where people have their inputs, and then it goes to a different department, and then it goes to a different department, then it goes to a vendor. It takes forever. So all these decision making, all the inputs are happening as a team, which is the strategy partner like us, plus their internal teams, which are different stakeholders within that. And they come to a consensus and a decision, and the decisions are done on a regular level. So every day Scrum meetings, really adopting Agile and DevOps to meet these numbers, all of that becoming very, very critical. So the organizational changes, it has to be top down, And most of these guys are doing this top-down, because if you do not do it top-down, this will never get done. But they need to do that to make this happen. The technology, yes, looking at cloud-based technology. So adopting cloud-based kind of infrastructure, taking a look at microservices-based architecture, trying to look at much more of a digital marketplace kind of a thing, where you are bringing together an app store type of business model, having the right orchestration in place, which is where we get we get into the revenue management and orchestration of the digital marketplace or a NAS solution very, very effectively with the customers. So so from a technology standpoint, right, it's about having the right orchestration in place. It's about having the right revenue management solutions, the partner management solutions, catalog, all of these things in place becomes important, as well as the digital marketplace, because you are now trying to bring together, or the operator is trying to bring together an app store-like model for the end customers. The orchestration bit becomes the heart, because now you are talking about cloud-based services, you're talking about applications, you're talking about data center technologies, you're also talking about your legacy architecture, because let's face it, the legacy architecture will have to coexist with your next generation of SDN technology or your NMP technologies, and so on and so on. How do you tie it all together? So that becomes very critical. And the processes, right? So as I said, I touched upon before, talking about the waterfall processes, the way traditionally the operators have done it, which takes them 6 to 12 to 18 months to launch a service, doesn't really work so well when you talk about virtualization. So moving into Agile, moving into DevOps, adopting those things becomes very, very critical. And all the the examples I gave are companies who have adopted those very successfully. So it's a very common thread. And so all of these are easier to talk about, but it's very difficult to adopt, because companies have their unions. They have their way of their organizational hierarchies. They have their own separation and split between network and IT and other teams. And so it's easier to say that let's come together, they're going to have a satellite team. But from an organizational standpoint, it is a very, very tough thing to do. But in order to do this successfully, we are seeing some of the tier 1 operators doing this very effectively. So they're driving change within their organization to adopt virtualization and make it effective for them.
Okay, great. Well, then one last question, and that's sort of how you see these things evolving over the next few years. I think we've sort of moved past, or we're beginning to move past maybe the first instances, and we're moving out of the labs and into more and more implementations now. Do you have any thoughts on what it's going to take for us to sort of get to the taking full advantage of virtualization, and and maybe some of the contributing factors that are going to drive that? I mean, I've definitely heard a lot about virtualization in 5G, virtualization in IoT. Whether that's in an LTE or a 5G context. What are your thoughts on the continuing evolution of virtualization?
I think we have started to move the needle in terms of adopting virtualization and becoming mainstream. What we are going to see in the next few years is adoption of virtualization at scale. Not one service, not two services, but most of the network infrastructure becoming more and more virtualized. You mentioned a very good point, 5G. A lot of the specs, a lot of the standards around 5G are work in progress even now. However, there are a lot of different variations of 5G enablers and so on. Basics are there, but there are a lot of fine-tuning around certain things. However, adopting virtualization or making it as a stepping stone for 5G related services is absolutely mission critical. It needs to happen. And we are seeing that as many of our customers trying to do. So on-demand network slicing, for example. Using, how can you could have done network slicing in the past. People have done it. It was very static. It was very piecemeal. It was done very in a very static way, and so on. Now you can create on-demand slices. At least that's the promise of 5G. In order to be able to do that, you need a virtualized infrastructure which can be scaled up or scaled down depending on the needs of your infrastructure deployment. So, 5G or of the precursor to 5G being virtualization, I think those are obvious things to happen. And if you talk about network as a slice, or slicing the network the right way for different types of vertical services, you then connect to the IoT dot, right? I mean, the IoT now becomes important. Are you looking at healthcare? Are you looking at the financial industry, or car, or automobiles, or whatever? That becomes an important criteria. So IoT-related services vertical, and we are seeing that with NEC, our parent company, in a lot of our markets, where virtualization is an enabler for some of the very critical IoT-centric services. It started to happen in smart cities and in other type of business models. So you will see that evolving. So I would say 3-4 things, right? One is virtualization at scale. So more and more services, not one service or two services people talk about, but a whole bunch of different services. You will see a lot of replacement. Okay. So services running on legacy infrastructure, moving away to more of a virtualized layer. Okay. And then you are shutting that down and then moving those things. So the cap and grow model in terms of virtualization. Precursor to 5G. When 5G becomes much more, the standards are all clocked out correctly. There's a whole bunch of different variations once we know the right trajectory, but the trials are already started. Okay. And virtualization becomes an enabler for that. And obviously IoT. I think between all of these and on-demand nature of the business, these are the areas where you will see a lot more movement. The other part, which will slightly start to now take place, is on the consumer side of the house. Now that we saw a lot of B2B stuff, a lot of the initiatives were out the B2B business. We will see a lot more also. Those use cases slowly being moved into the consumer segment as well. So we haven't seen a whole lot of that. We have seen a little less of that, but we'll see. But when you look at 5G and the whole cloud RAN, or you're looking at the packet core becoming more cloudified and virtual and so on, we already see the intersection between virtualization, intersection between some of these evolving technologies as operators try to. So I think there will be a combination of things, but the scaling of virtualization from 1 to 5, 10 services or chains to a whole bunch of those, that's the first step we will see happening.
Okay, great. Well, Ari, thank you so much for the time today. It was really great to talk with you about this, and I appreciate having the chance to get your perspective.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
So that wraps up this week's episode. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.